Can 8 minutes and 22 seconds of seemingly chaotic sound destroy your entire perception of what music should be? When John Lennon, alongside Yoko Ono and George Harrison, assembled the longest track in the Beatles' entire catalog, they weren't simply creating another song. They were throwing down a sonic gauntlet, challenging every preconception about what belonged on a pop record. The piece that emerged from those late spring sessions in 1968 at EMI Studios remains, more than half a century later, the most divisive, controversial, and misunderstood recording the Beatles ever released. It has been called everything from groundbreaking genius to an embarrassing indulgence, from a revolutionary masterwork to an unlistenable mess. But here's what rarely gets discussed with the seriousness it deserves. Beneath the surface chaos, beneath the tape loops and backwards orchestras, beneath the haunting repetition of number 9, number 9, number 9, lies a meticulously constructed work of musique concrète that accomplished something unprecedented in popular music history. To understand what Lennon and his collaborators achieved, we need to first demolish some persistent myths. The most damaging one is that Revolution 9 was a random drug-fueled collage thrown together without structure or intent. Nothing could be further from the truth. The composition originated during the first recording session for Revolution on May 30th, 1968. That initial take stretched beyond 10 minutes, with the final 6 minutes consisting of Lennon and Ono vocalizing, screaming, and moaning over increasingly dissonant soundscapes. Rather than discard this material as most producers would have done, Lennon recognized its potential as raw material for something more ambitious. What followed was not improvisation, but careful construction. Over multiple sessions in June 1968, Lennon worked with Ono and Harrison to layer approximately 20 tape loops sourced from EMI's extensive sound library. These weren't random selections. They included backwards violins, backwards symphonic passages, orchestral excerpts from A Day in the Life, operatic vocals, choral singing, applause, banging glasses, fire crackling, backwards mellotron, and various spoken phrases. Each element was selected and positioned with specific intent. The most immediately recognizable motif, that hypnotic number 9 incantation, came from an EMI test tape where an engineer's voice intoned, "This is EMI test series number 9. Lennon isolated those 3 words and created a rhythmic anchor that recurs throughout the piece. This wasn't accident or whimsy. The number 9 held profound personal significance for Lennon. He was born on October 9th. Brian Epstein discovered the Beatles on November 9th. EMI signed them on May 9th. Their first album was recorded in September, and he met Yoko Ono on November 9th. But beyond personal symbolism, the repetition of number 9 functions musically as a drone, a tonal center around which the other elements orbit and collide. This technique has clear precedence in 20th century composition, particularly in the work of composers Lennon was actively studying at the time. Pierre Schaeffer, the French composer who essentially invented musique concrète in the late 1940s, developed an aesthetic centered on using recorded sound as the primary compositional resource. Schaeffer's fundamental insight was that music could be constructed from concrete sounds that existed in the world, rather than abstract notation translated through instruments. He collected sounds from anywhere and everywhere, then manipulated them through tape techniques, playing them backwards, varying their speed, cutting and splicing, creating loops, layering multiple sources. The goal was not to create pretty melodies, but to explore the inherent musical properties of sound itself, divorced from its original context. When you hear a train in Schaeffer's Étude au chemin de fer from 1948, you're not meant to think, "Oh, that's a train." You're meant to hear the rhythmic pulses, the timbral qualities, the attacks and decays of the sound as abstract musical events. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the German composer whose face appears on the Sgt. Pepper album cover, extended these ideas into electronic music proper, while also working extensively with musique concrète techniques. His piece Gesang der Junglinge from 1955-56 combined electronically generated Sina waves with the recorded voice of a boy soprano, creating dense, spatially distributed soundscapes that moved beyond traditional concepts of melody, harmony, and rhythm. Stockhausen was fascinated by what he called statistical composition, focusing on the directional tendencies of sound movement, the transformation from one sonic state to another. Paul McCartney had been listening to Stockhausen since 1966, and his ideas directly influenced Tomorrow Never Knows on Revolver. By 1968, when Revolution 9 was being assembled, both McCartney and Lennon had absorbed these concepts, though they would apply them in different ways. Edgar Varèse, the French-American composer, also loomed large in this experimental landscape. Varèse saw music as organized sound, rather than as notes on a staff. His Poème électronique, premiered at the 1958 Brussels World's Fair, through a system of 400 loudspeakers, combined musique concrète techniques with electronic synthesis to create an immersive sonic environment. Frank Zappa, another crucial influence on the experimental wing of rock music, paid explicit tribute to Varèse in pieces like The Return of the Son of Monster Magnet from 1966. The Mothers of Invention's approach to sound collage, tape manipulation, and sonic satire directly paralleled what Lennon would attempt in Revolution 9, though with different artistic goals. What makes Revolution 9 remarkable is not that it employed these techniques. It's that it did so on a major label release by the biggest band in the world, ensuring that millions of people who had never heard of Schaeffer, Stockhausen, or Varèse would encounter their ideas through a Beatles album. The piece functioned as a Trojan horse, smuggling genuinely radical avant-garde concepts into suburban living rooms worldwide. Consider what David Quantick wrote in 2002. The track remains the most radical and innovative track ever to bring a rock record to its climax. And no one in the history of recorded music has ever been so successful in introducing such extreme music to so many people. But success in introducing extreme music doesn't necessarily translate to aesthetic success. And here's where the controversy intensifies. Critics and fans have split sharply. Some hear a masterwork of organization and intent. Others hear self-indulgent noise. Mark Richardson of Pitchfork called it a really great and certainly frightening piece of avant-garde art that the biggest pop band in the world exposed millions of fans to. Conversely, one critic described it as almighty turds, and it was voted the worst Beatles song in one of the earliest polls conducted by WPLJ and The Village Voice in 1971. These aren't reconcilable positions. They reflect fundamentally different conceptions of what music should do and what criteria we should use to judge it. Let's address the most common criticism directly. It's not even music, it's just random noise. This statement reveals a profound misunderstanding of both the piece itself and of 20th century musical development. Random noise would be genuinely aleatory, like John Cage's chance operations, where decisions are made by rolling dice or consulting the I Ching. Revolution 9 is not random. It has a carefully constructed arc, moving through distinct sections that you can identify on repeated listening. The piece opens with that spoken phrase about forgetting the claret, establishing an almost conversational intimacy before the number 9 motif enters. The early sections feature relatively sparse textures, allowing individual elements to be clearly perceived. As the piece progresses, the density increases, more layers accumulate. The stereo field becomes more actively manipulated, with sounds panning rapidly from left to right and back again, creating spatial disorientation. Around the midpoint, there's a passage dominated by crowd noises and what sounds like a revolution in progress, people shouting, chaos erupting. This isn't accident. Lennon explicitly stated he was trying to paint a picture of revolution using sound. The title isn't metaphorical. The stereo panning deserves particular attention because it reveals sophisticated technical thinking. In 1968, stereo was still relatively new in pop music, and most recordings used it conservatively, simply separating instruments into different channels. Revolution 9 treats the stereo field as a compositional parameter. Sounds don't just exist in space, they move through space. Applause travels from one speaker to the other. Horn sounds are met with whooshing, zooming effects that suggest motion, speed, vehicles rushing past. These techniques would become standard in progressive rock within just a few years, but in 1968, they were genuinely novel, at least in the pop music context. The piece also makes extensive use of abrupt cuts, sounds truncated before they complete, creating what one listener described as a proto-version of perfectly cut screams humor, decades before that became a thing. There's genuine wit in some of these juxtapositions, a sense of play that often goes unrecognized because people are so busy recoiling from the overall strangeness. The backwards elements warrant closer examination. Reverse tape was not new in 1968. The Beatles had used it on Rain and Tomorrow Never Knows in 1966, and many psychedelic bands incorporated the technique. But Revolution 9 uses backwards material structurally rather than decoratively. The backwards violins and backwards symphony excerpts create harmonic language that sounds alien, precisely because it reverses the natural envelope of acoustic instruments. When you play a violin note backwards, the slow attack becomes an abrupt decay, and the natural decay becomes a slow swell. This inverts our expectations about how sounds behave in time, creating profound cognitive dissonance. It's unsettling by design. The piece wants you unsettled. It's depicting revolution, upheaval, the overturning of established order. Backwards orchestras are the sonic equivalent of the world turned upside down. The rhythmic organization is more subtle but equally important. Revolution 9 has no steady pulse in the traditional sense, no backbeat driving it forward. But it does have rhythm, complex polyrhythmic relationships emerging from the interaction of its various loops and layers. The number 9 voice recurs at regular intervals, creating a kind of mantra-like pulse. Against this, other elements enter and exit, each with their own rhythmic character. Fire crackling has its own stochastic rhythm. Crowd noise surges and subsides. The backwards mellotron creates long-sustained gestures that contrast with the percussive attacks of other elements. What emerges is not groove, but momentum, a sense of the piece unfolding through time, with definite direction and purpose. Timbral exploration is central to Musique Concrète, and Revolution 9 offers a masterclass in it. Traditional orchestral music uses a relatively limited palette of timbres, all acoustic instruments with related harmonic spectra. Revolution 9 juxtaposes wildly disparate sound sources, human voices both normal and processed, acoustic instruments forward and backward, electronic oscillations from mellotron and other sources, mechanical noises, environmental sounds. Each timbre brings its own associations, its own history. Opera carries centuries of classical tradition. Fire carries primordial resonance. Crowd noise carries political and social implications. By layering these timbres, the piece creates semantic as well as sonic collisions. Meaning emerges from juxtaposition. This is fundamentally a linguistic approach to composition, treating sounds as signifiers in a system of musical semiotics. Paul McCartney's resistance to including Revolution 9 on the White Album has often been cited as evidence of the piece's weakness. But McCartney's objections were more complex than simple aesthetic judgment. He was in America on business when most of Revolution 9 was assembled, and his disappointment stemmed partly from being excluded from the creative process. More significantly, McCartney had been pushing the Beatles toward experimental work for years, introducing Lennon to the avant-garde scene, and he had been making sound collages at home since 1966. He led the charge on Tomorrow Never Knows, and created the unreleased 14-minute piece Carnival of Light 18 months before Revolution 9. His resistance may have reflected frustration that Lennon was now pursuing this direction without him, and also disagreement with the destructive, chaotic character of Lennon's piece versus McCartney's own more controlled experiments. George Harrison's role has been underappreciated. According to multiple sources, including Yoko Ono herself, Harrison significantly influenced Revolution 9 and may have instigated the project. He selected many of the sounds from EMI's tape library, alongside Ringo Starr, and his own experimental work on the Wonderwall music album, particularly the piece Dream Scene, showed similar techniques. Harrison's experimental piece predated Revolution 9, suggesting he brought crucial conceptual groundwork to the collaboration. This matters because it complicates the narrative that Revolution 9 was purely Lennon and Ono's project. an isolated aberration. Harrison's involvement indicates broader interest within the Beatles for this kind of experimentation, even if the final result exceeded what most band members were comfortable releasing. The question of whether Revolution 9 works aesthetically cannot be answered objectively because it depends on what you believe music should accomplish. If you believe music should provide pleasure through consonance, melody, rhythm, and emotional accessibility, then Revolution 9 fails spectacularly. It offers none of those things in conventional ways. It's deliberately abrasive, disorienting, and challenging. But if you believe music can and should explore the full potential of sound as organized in time, if you believe music can depict psychological and social states that aren't reducible to simple emotions, if you believe music can function as sonic poetry or sonic cinema rather than only as song, then Revolution 9 succeeds brilliantly. It achieves exactly what it set out to do: create a sound painting of revolutionary chaos using the full resources of the recording studio. The historical impact is undeniable. After Revolution 9, the floodgates opened for experimental work in rock music. Pink Floyd's Several Species of Small Furry Animals gathered together in a cave, and Grooving with a Pict from Umaguma in 1969 used similar tape manipulation techniques. The progressive rock explosion of the early 1970s, with bands like King Crimson, Yes, Genesis, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, all benefited from the space that Revolution 9 opened up. While most prog bands pursued virtuosity and symphonic ambition rather than avant-garde chaos, the very fact that a Beatles album could contain 8 minutes of sound collage legitimized extended unconventional composition in rock. The German krautrock scene, with bands like Kahn, Faust, and Amandul II, took the experimental ethos even further, often citing the Beatles' late-period work as inspiration. In America, Zappa continued pushing boundaries, but post-1968 he could do so knowing that mainstream audiences had already been exposed to similar ideas through the Beatles. The piece also influenced hip-hop, though this connection is rarely acknowledged. Musique Concrète's fundamental technique of sampling and repurposing existing recordings is precisely what hip-hop would do starting in the mid-1970s. The difference is that hip-hop developed sampling technology that allowed more precise manipulation and rhythmic control. But the conceptual breakthrough, the idea that pre-existing recordings could be raw material for new composition, was central to both Musique Concrète and hip-hop. Revolution 9 appeared 5 years before hip-hop emerged as a distinct genre, demonstrating these techniques in a widely distributed commercial release. While hip-hop developed independently through DJ culture in the Bronx, the broader cultural acceptance of sampling and sound collage was undoubtedly influenced by pieces like Revolution 9. The Charles Manson connection represents one of the darkest aspects of Revolution 9's reception. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi documented that Manson believed many songs on the White Album contained references to his apocalyptic race war scenario dubbed Helter Skelter. According to testimony, Manson mentioned Revolution 9 more often than any other track, interpreting it as parallel to Chapter 9 of the Book of Revelation, and hearing Lennon's distorted screams of "Right" as commands to rise. This grotesque misreading had nothing to do with the piece's actual content or intent, but it permanently tainted Revolution 9 in American consciousness, associating it with one of the most horrific crimes of the 1960s. The fact that a psychotic cult leader heard revolutionary violence in the piece doesn't invalidate it artistically, but it does demonstrate the power of sonic ambiguity. Revolution 9 leaves enough interpretive space for listeners to project their own meanings, fears, and obsessions onto it. Technically, the piece rewards close attention to its construction. Music scholar Mark Lewisone studied the original 4-track recording and identified distinct elements: choir, backwards violins, backwards symphony, orchestral overdubs from A Day in the Life, banging glasses, applause, opera, backwards mellotron, humming spoken phrases by John and George, and a cassette tape of Yoko and John screaming, "Right." These elements were combined through multiple generations of tape bouncing, which introduced inevitable degradation and noise. But that degradation became part of the aesthetic. The piece sounds aged, weathered, as if retrieved from some archaeological dig of sound. This lo-fi quality, the audible tape hiss and generation loss, adds to the unsettling atmosphere. Modern digital manipulation could create pristine sound collages, but they would lack the warmth and grit that makes Revolution 9 feel organic despite its artificiality. The philosophical implications extend beyond music into broader questions about art's function in society. The avant-garde has always positioned itself in opposition to bourgeois comfort and easy consumption. Schaeffer, Stockhausen, Varese, and their contemporaries were explicitly rejecting the idea that music should be pleasant or accessible. They believed music could and should challenge listeners, forcing them to reconsider their assumptions about sound, about listening, about what constitutes musical experience. This tradition extends back through Debussy, Stravinsky, and Schoenberg to Wagner and even Beethoven, composers who were considered radically difficult in their own times. Every generation produces music that seems to push too far, and every generation eventually absorbs what once seemed impossible. Revolution 9 sits firmly in this tradition. It asks more of listeners than they're typically willing to give a pop record. But here's the crucial thing. Revolution 9 isn't asking you to like it. It's not trying to please you. It's trying to shake you, to disorient you, to make you question your comfortable assumptions about what a Beatles record should sound like. That's its entire purpose. Judged by that criterion, it succeeds completely. No other track on the White Album, no other track in the Beatles' entire discography, generates such strong reactions. People either vehemently defend it or viscerally reject it. Very few are indifferent. That level of engagement, even when the engagement is negative, indicates the piece is doing something significant. Bad music is forgettable. Challenging music generates controversy. The comparison to progressive rock is illuminating. Progressive rock in its classic 1970s form pursued many of the same goals as Revolution 9. Extended composition, complex structures, incorporation of classical and jazz influences, ambitious conceptual frameworks, but progressive rock almost always retained conventional musical elements like melody, harmony, clear instrumentation, and virtuosic performance. Even at its most experimental, early King Crimson or Van der Graaf Generator still featured recognizable songs with guitars, keyboards, bass, drums. Revolution 9 abandons all of that. It's pure sound sculpture. This makes it more radical than most prog rock, but also more alienating. Progressive rock fans who love 20-minute suites with shifting time signatures and mellotron orchestrations often still can't stand Revolution 9 because it offers none of the conventional musical pleasures they enjoy. It's avant-garde in the truest sense. Ahead of the guard, out in front of what the audience is ready to accept. Does it belong on the White Album? This question has generated endless debate. Some argue the White Album would be stronger as a single album, with only the best tracks, and Revolution 9 would be first to go. Others insist the White Album's greatness derives precisely from its sprawling, contradictory nature, and removing Revolution 9 would diminish that essential character. There's truth in both positions. Certainly the album could function without Revolution 9. The sequencing of Side 4 would flow more smoothly from Cry Baby Cry directly to Good Night, but something would be lost. Something crucial to what the White Album represents. The album is a portrait of a band fracturing, pursuing wildly divergent artistic visions, barely holding together. Revolution 9 is the most extreme expression of that fracturing, the moment where conventional song form collapses entirely. Including it makes a statement. This is where we are now. This is how far we're willing to push. Removing it would sanitize that statement, make the album safer and more palatable, but less truthful. The piece has been covered and reinterpreted by various artists over the decades, though less frequently than most Beatles compositions. Phish performed it at their legendary Halloween 1994 concert, where they played the entire White Album. The jam band's version demonstrated that Revolution 9 could be approached as a score for live improvisation, with musicians responding in real time to the recorded collage. Other versions have been recorded by Kurt Hoffman's Band of Weeds, Def FX, Little Fyodor, the Shazam, and Brazilian musician Rogério Skylab. Each interpretation necessarily diverges significantly from the original, because the piece resists conventional performance. You can't simply pick up instruments and play Revolution 9. It exists only as a recorded artifact, a fact that emphasizes its status as musique concrète rather than as song. For listeners approaching Revolution 9 for the first time, or for those who've dismissed it in the past, here's what I'd suggest. Don't try to like it. Don't approach it expecting pleasure in any conventional sense. Instead, approach it as you would approach abstract visual art. When you look at a Jackson Pollock drip painting, you're not looking for representational accuracy. You're looking at the interplay of colors, lines, textures, the energy captured in the gestures frozen on canvas. Revolution 9 works similarly. Listen for the interplay of timbres. Listen for how sounds move through the stereo field. Listen for the architecture of the piece, how it builds and releases tension, how it establishes motifs and returns to them transformed. Listen for the semantic associations different sounds carry, and how their juxtaposition creates meaning. Most importantly, listen multiple times. The piece reveals itself gradually. On first listen, it sounds like chaos. By the fifth listen, you start hearing patterns, relationships, structure. By the 10th listen, you're navigating the piece like familiar territory, anticipating the horn swooshes, the crowd surges, the backwards orchestras. Ultimately, Revolution 9 represents a road not taken in the Beatles' evolution. Had they stayed together, had they continued pushing boundaries, they might have produced more pieces like this. We might have gotten entire albums exploring sound collage and experimental composition. Instead, the band split, and each member pursued solo work that occasionally touched on these ideas, but never with the same audacity. Lennon and Ono's unfinished music series continued in this vein, but those releases reached a tiny fraction of the White Album's audience. McCartney's subsequent work largely abandoned experimentation in favor of melodic popcraft. Harrison pursued Indian music and devotional song. Starr made genial pop-rock albums. Revolution 9 stands alone, an outlier, a glimpse of what might have been. The piece also raises questions about artistic democracy within bands. Should every member have veto power over what gets released? Lennon insisted on including Revolution 9, despite resistance from other Beatles and producer George Martin. Was he right to do so? Or did he abuse his position within the band to force through a self-indulgent project? There's no easy answer. In retrospect, including Revolution 9 was clearly the right decision from a historical and artistic perspective, even though it alienated many fans. But at the time, with the band's commercial supremacy at stake, it was a genuine risk. That Lennon was willing to take that risk speaks to his artistic integrity and his refusal to play it safe. The final question is whether Revolution 9 is good. Not groundbreaking or historically important or influential, but simply good as a piece of music. This question returns us to first principles. What do we mean by good? Good at what? If we mean technically proficient execution of established forms, then no. Revolution 9 is not good. It doesn't display virtuosity in any traditional sense. But if we mean effective achievement of stated artistic goals, then yes, it's very good indeed. Lennon wanted to paint a picture of revolution in sound, to create chaos and disorientation and tension, to push the boundaries of what could exist on a Beatles record. He succeeded completely. The piece does exactly what it intends to do with economy of means and conceptual clarity. That deserves to be called good, even if the result is deeply uncomfortable. The uncomfortable truth that both defenders and detractors often miss is that Revolution 9 can be both brilliant and unlistenable simultaneously. These aren't contradictory positions. Some brilliant art is difficult to experience. Some unlistenable art is brilliant precisely because it refuses to accommodate listeners' expectations. Revolution 9 occupies this paradoxical space, simultaneously a triumph of avant-garde vision and a trial for anyone who just wanted another Beatles song. Accepting both truths at once, holding that tension without resolving it into simple praise or condemnation, might be the most honest response to this endlessly fascinating, deeply strange, utterly unique piece of music.